Douglas and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary last spring, though only I knew it would be our last. For 3 decades, I had collected evidence of his ongoing affair with his college sweetheart, carefully storing each piece away like precious jewels. On the night of our Pearl anniversary celebration, while he raised a toast to 30 more years, I slid a single photograph across the table that shattered the facade we'd lived behind for half our lives. The restaurant fell, silent around us as the color drained from his face. In that moment, the carefully constructed world we had built together began to crumble, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt something close to freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Wilson, though most people call me Maggie. I'm 67 now, with silver streaks running through my once-auburn hair and laugh lines that have deepened over decades of pretending everything was fine. I met Douglas when I was 35, recently divorced and determined to build a career in architectural preservation. He was 40, charismatic, and already making a name for himself in historical restoration. Our paths crossed at a fundraiser for the Westbrook Historical Society, where I was presenting my proposal for saving the old library building from demolition. "Your passion for these old buildings is infectious," he told me that night, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. "Most people see crumbling stone and rotting wood, but you see the stories, don't you?" I did. I had always been able to look at an abandoned structure and see not what it was, but what it had been, and what it could be again with the right care and attention. I applied that same hopeful vision to people, to relationships. Perhaps that was my first mistake. We were married within a year. A small ceremony at the newly restored Hawthorne Gardens, a Victorian estate that Douglas had brought back to life. My daughter from my first marriage, Lily, was our flower girl. At 12 years old, she was wary of Douglas at first, but he won her over with his patience and the wooden dollhouse he built for her, a perfect replica of the Hawthorne main building. "He notices the details, Mom," Lily told me once. "That's how you know he really cares." She was right. Douglas noticed everything. The slightly uneven grain in a piece of reclaimed wood, the exact shade of paint needed to match a century-old wall, the precise angle at which sunlight would strike a restored window. It was one of the things I loved most about him, this attention to detail, this commitment to authenticity. The irony isn't lost on me now. We settled into a comfortable life in Mapleton, a small town nestled between rolling hills and the winding Carleton River. Douglas's restoration. Business grew, and I eventually opened a small architectural consulting firm specializing in historical buildings. We purchased an 1880s Victorian that had fallen into disrepair and spent years bringing it back to its former glory, one room at a time. Every weekend was filled with trips to salvage yards, antique shops, and estate sales, hunting for the perfect pieces to complete our home. It was our shared passion, this business of resurrection. "We're like archaeologists," Douglas would say, "except instead of uncovering the past, we're preserving it for the future." For 10 years, our marriage was what I had always hoped for, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection. Douglas was attentive, thoughtful, and seemingly devoted. When he was away on business trips to source materials or consult on projects in other cities, I never worried. I trusted him completely until the day I found the letter. It was tucked inside a book on Victorian architecture that Douglas had been reading, a cream-colored envelope with elegant handwriting I didn't recognize. I wasn't snooping. I had simply picked up the book to reference something for a client project. The letter slipped out and fluttered to the floor like a fallen leaf. I shouldn't have read it. Even now, I sometimes wish I hadn't. But once my eyes caught the opening line, "My dearest Douglas, these weeks without you have been unbearable," I couldn't stop. The letter was from someone named Catherine. She wrote of secret weekends in Boston, of promises Douglas had made, of a love that had apparently spanned decades. 20 years since we found each other again, she wrote, and still every moment with you feels like coming home. 20 years. Douglas and I had been married for 20 years at that point, which meant their affair, whatever it was, had been going on almost since the beginning. My first instinct was confrontation. I imagined myself waiting for him to return from his current business trip, the letter in hand, demanding explanations, apologies, promises to end it. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was pride, or shock, or a deep-seated fear of what would happen if everything I'd built my life around collapsed at once. Instead, I placed the letter back in the book, exactly where I'd found it, and began to pay attention in a way I never had before. I noticed how Douglas's business trips often coincided with architectural conferences in Boston, how he always came back from these trips with a particular kind of energy, sometimes melancholy, sometimes almost giddy, how he would occasionally mention an old colleague named Catherine Denham, who specialized in stained glass restoration and whose work he admired. I started keeping track, dates, locations, inconsistencies in his stories. I wasn't plotting revenge, not yet. I was simply gathering information, trying to understand the true shape of my marriage beneath the beautiful facade we had constructed. One evening, about 6 months after finding the letter, Douglas mentioned that Catherine Denham would be presenting at the Northeast Preservation Conference in Cambridge that weekend. "I'm thinking of attending," he said casually over dinner. "Her techniques for restoring 19th century glass are revolutionary. Could be useful for the Harrington Estate project." I nodded, took a sip of wine. "You should go," I said. "Sounds fascinating." He looked momentarily surprised by my encouragement, then pleased. "I'll make a reservation at that hotel near Harvard Square," he said, "the one with the good breakfast." After he left on Friday morning, I did something I had never imagined myself doing. I drove to Cambridge myself, checked into a different hotel, and waited. It wasn't difficult to find them. The preservation community was small, and the conference schedule was published online. I sat in the back of the lecture hall during Catherine's presentation, a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked dark hair and an authoritative presence. Douglas was in the front row, leaning forward slightly, completely engrossed. Afterwards, I followed them to a small French restaurant near the river. Through the window, I watched them toast with champagne, their heads bent close together, fingers intertwined on the table. I took the first photograph that night, not out of anger or for future leverage, but because some part of me needed tangible proof that what I was seeing was real. That should have been the moment I confronted him, or left him, or at least spoke to someone about what I had discovered. But life is rarely as straightforward as we would like it to be. Lily had just announced her pregnancy with our first grandchild. Douglas's mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The Harrington Estate restoration, the largest project our firms had ever collaborated on, was at a critical phase, so I said nothing. I filed the photograph away in a locked drawer of my desk and went on with my life. And if Douglas noticed any change in me, he never mentioned it. Over the next 10 years, I collected more evidence, hotel receipts that fell from his pockets, a text message glimpsed when his phone lit up, occasional photographs when the opportunity presented itself. I built a complete picture of their relationship, this parallel life he had been living alongside our own. Catherine lived in Boston, where she ran a successful studio specializing in historical stained glass. They met at least once a month, usually under the guise of professional obligations. They vacationed together once a year, while I visited. Lily and her family in Seattle, Douglas would supposedly go on fishing trips with college friends. I learned that they had been college sweethearts at Cornell, where they both studied architecture. They had broken up after graduation when Catherine received a prestigious fellowship in London, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Douglas had reconnected with her at a preservation conference in Boston during our 10th year of marriage, and their affair had begun shortly after. The strangest part was that I didn't hate him for it. Not really. The rage I expected never fully materialized. Instead, I felt a profound sadness for all three of us. For Douglas, living his divided life. For Catherine, sharing her love with a man who would never fully belong to her. And for myself, building my world around a marriage that had never been what I thought it was. Meanwhile, our life in Mapleton continued. We became grandparents when Lily gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl who looked at Douglas with adoring eyes when he built them elaborate wooden toys in his workshop. We restored a crumbling church together, transforming it into a community arts center that won national recognition. We hosted dinner parties where colleagues commented on what a perfect couple we were, how lucky to have found a partner who shared the same passions. "What's your secret?" they would ask, glasses of wine in hand, looking at us with genuine curiosity. "Respect for the past," Douglas would answer with a smile, "and commitment to the future." I would nod and smile and wonder if he ever heard the hollow ring in his own words. As our 30th anniversary approached, Douglas suggested we celebrate with a special dinner at Riverside, the upscale restaurant where he had proposed. 30 years deserve something memorable, he said, squeezing my hand across our breakfast table. "I've already made reservations," I agreed, thinking that yes, this anniversary should indeed be memorable. That evening, as I prepared for dinner, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and removed a small leather-bound portfolio. Inside was a selection of the evidence I had gathered over the years. Not everything, just enough. At the top was the most recent photograph, taken just 3 weeks earlier. Douglas and Catherine in a garden I recognized as belonging to the Winthrop Hotel in Boston. Her head on his shoulder, his lips pressed to her hair. On the back, I had written the date and a simple note. "I've always known." I slipped the photograph into my evening bag, along with the small velvet box that contained Douglas's anniversary gift, a pair of antique cufflinks I had found at an estate sale, crafted from mother of pearl. Pearls for 30 years. Traditional, appropriate, a symbol of wisdom gained through irritation. How fitting. Douglas picked me up promptly at 7, handsome in his best suit, a bouquet of cream roses in hand, my favorite. "You look beautiful," he said, and I could tell he meant it. This was the confusing part, the part that had kept me in this marriage for years after I discovered the truth. He did love me, in his way, just not enough to be faithful, and not enough to be honest. The restaurant had outdone itself. Our table overlooked the river, candlelight dancing across white linens, a bottle of champagne already chilling in a silver bucket. Douglas was the perfect husband that evening, attentive, charming, reminiscing about our years together. "Remember? When we stripped all the wallpaper in the dining room and found those hand-painted murals underneath?" he asked, smiling at the memory. "You were covered in paste, but you looked at those faded landscapes like you'd discovered buried treasure." I nodded, returning his smile. "And you stayed up all night researching techniques to preserve them, even though you had a presentation the next morning." "Some things are worth the effort," he said, raising his glass. "To 30 years with the most remarkable woman I've ever known. And to 30 more." The restaurant had gone quiet around us, other diners smiling at the obvious anniversary celebration taking place. Douglas reached inside his jacket and withdrew a long, slim velvet box. "Happy anniversary, Maggie." Inside was a pearl necklace, each perfectly matched orb gleaming in the candlelight. "It's exquisite," I said truthfully. "Would you help me put it on?" He stood, coming around to fasten the clasp behind my neck, his fingers warm against my skin. When he returned to his seat, I reached into my evening bag and placed the small box with the cufflinks before him. For you, I said. Pearl is traditional for 30 years. Douglas opened the box, his expression genuinely touched. They're perfect, Maggie. Exactly my taste. He immediately began removing his current cufflinks to replace them with my gift. Watched him, this man I had shared my life with, and felt a strange calm settle over me. I have something else for you, I said, reaching once more into my bag. I withdrew the photograph and placed it face down on the table between us. Something to commemorate our years together. He looked at me quizzically before turning over the photograph. The change in his expression was immediate, the color draining from his face, his fingers suddenly still on the cufflink he had been fastening. His eyes, when they met mine, held something I had never seen there before. Pure, unmasked fear. Maggie, I held up a hand, stopping him. 30 years, Douglas, I said quietly. 30 years that I've been your wife, and 30 years that you've been lying to me. I can explain, he began, his voice barely audible. I'm sure you can, I replied. You've had plenty of practice, but I don't need explanations. Not anymore. I touched the pearl necklace he had just fastened around my neck. Do you know how pearls are formed? An irritant, a grain of sand, enters the oyster, and it responds by coating the intruder with layer after layer of nacre. The oyster can't expel the irritant, so it creates something beautiful from its pain. I met his gaze steadily. That's what I've been doing for 20 years, Douglas. Creating something beautiful from the pain of knowing about you and Catherine. The restaurant continued its quiet hum around us, oblivious to the collapse occurring at our table. Douglas stared at the photograph, then back at me, realization dawning in his eyes. How long have you known? He asked finally. Since our 10th anniversary, I answered. The letter in your architecture book. I've known about every meeting, every trip, every lie since then. He closed his eyes briefly. Why didn't you say anything? Why stay? It was the question I had asked myself countless times over the years. I took a sip of champagne, considering my answer carefully. At first, it was shock, then practical concerns. Lily's pregnancy, your mother's illness, our business commitments. Later, I suppose it was habit, the comfort of the known, even when the known is painful. I paused, and a strange kind of curiosity. I wanted to see how long it would go on, how far you would take it, whether you would ever find the courage to tell me the truth. Douglas reached for my hand across the table. I allowed the contact, noting the tremble in his fingers. I've loved you, Maggie. That was never a lie. No, I agreed. Just insufficient. I withdrew my hand and stood, gathering my evening bag. The pearl necklace felt heavy against my skin, but I made no move to remove it. It was mine, after all, earned through years of silence, of watching, of knowing. I've already moved most of my things to the carriage house on the property, I told him. I'll be staying there while we sort out the separation. I've also taken the liberty of contacting Patricia Henderson about handling the divorce. Patricia was the most formidable divorce attorney in the county, known for her meticulous preparation and unflinching advocacy for her clients. Douglas looked stricken. Divorce? Maggie, please, we can work through this. I'll end it with Catherine, I swear. It should have ended years ago. I smiled at him then, a genuine smile tinged with sadness. I believe you would try. But some patterns are too deeply ingrained to break, Douglas. You've been living this double life for so long, I'm not sure you know how to live any other way. I turned to leave, then paused, looking back at him one last time. Keep the photograph, I said softly. Consider it a parting gift, a piece of the past, preserved for posterity. Isn't that what we've always done best? As I walked out of the restaurant, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I had finally set down a burden I had been carrying for too long. The cool evening air against my face felt like a promise of honesty, of possibility, of a life no longer built around someone else's deceptions. Behind me, in the warm glow of the restaurant, sat the man I had loved for 30 years, staring at photographic proof of his betrayal while wearing the pearl cufflinks I had given him, beautiful things created from years of irritation. The symmetry felt right, somehow, a fitting end to the restoration project that had been our marriage. Outside, I looked up at the night sky, stars emerging one by one in the deepening blue. For the first time in decades, I was nobody's wife, nobody's partner in preservation. Just Margaret Wilson, 67 years old, with silver in her hair and too many years spent looking backward. It was time, I decided, to begin looking forward. Instead, the morning after our anniversary dinner, I woke to the sound of rain pattering against the carriage house windows. For a moment, I felt disoriented, the unfamiliar bed, the absence of Douglas's steady breathing beside me. Then the events of the previous evening came flooding back, and I sat up, pressing my palms against my eyes. It wasn't regret I felt. Exactly. More like the dull ache that follows setting a broken bone, painful but necessary for proper healing. The carriage house had been my private project over the years, a small stone building at the edge of our property that I had slowly restored without Douglas's input. Initially, I had envisioned it as a guest cottage or perhaps a studio where I could work on smaller preservation projects. I never imagined it would become my refuge, but I had furnished it carefully nonetheless. A comfortable bed, a small kitchenette, a writing desk positioned before the east-facing window to catch the morning light. Outside, the rain transformed our carefully tended garden into a watercolor painting, softening the edges of the stone pathways and flower beds we had designed together. I watched a cardinal take shelter in the old oak tree, its red plumage startling against the gray morning. My phone buzzed, a text from Lily. "Mom, are you okay? Dad called me last night. He sounded devastated." I wasn't surprised. Douglas would naturally seek allies, and Lily had always adored her stepfather. What did surprise me was the follow-up message that arrived seconds later. "Whatever happened, I'm here for you. Both of you. No judgment." My throat tightened. When had my daughter become so wise? I typed back a simple reply. "I'm okay. We'll explain everything soon. Love you." By mid-morning, the rain had stopped, and I was sitting at my desk reviewing the separation agreement my attorney had prepared weeks earlier. I had been meticulous in my planning, just as I was with every restoration project. Each detail carefully considered, each potential problem anticipated. The document before me was fair, generous even. I had no desire to punish Douglas financially, only to disentangle our lives with minimal additional pain. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I knew it would be Douglas even before I opened it. He stood on the threshold looking haggard, his normally impeccable appearance rumpled, his eyes shadowed from what was clearly a sleepless night. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I stepped aside, gesturing to the small sitting area. He entered cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. His gaze swept around the carriage house, taking in the furnishings, the personal touches. "You've made this comfortable," he said, sounding almost surprised. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning is the wrong word," I replied, pouring 2 cups of coffee from the French press on the counter. "Preparing, perhaps, for several years now." Douglas accepted the coffee but didn't drink. "Maggie, we need to talk about this, about us. 30 years isn't something you just walk away from without a conversation." I settled into the armchair, across from him. "I agree. That's why I'm here instead of in Seattle with Lily, or on a plane to Europe. I owe our marriage the dignity of a proper ending." His expression flickered with something between hope and fear. "It doesn't have to end. I called Catherine this morning. I told her it's over, that I can't see her again." "And how did she respond?" Shadow crossed his face. She was upset. Said I was only doing this out of guilt and fear, not because I truly wanted to end things. Was she right? I asked quietly. He looked down at his untouched coffee. I don't know. Maybe, at first. But sitting here now, looking at this whole separate life you've been building without me even noticing, it's like waking up from a 30-year sleepwalk. I understood the feeling. My own awakening had begun 20 years earlier with that letter, but had accelerated dramatically in the past 24 hours. Do you love her? I asked, the question I had never allowed myself to voice. During all those years of silent knowledge, Douglas's shoulders slumped. Yes, he admitted. I've loved her since we were 20. But I love you too, Maggie. It's different, but it's real. His honesty, finally, after decades of deception. Strange, how it hurt and healed simultaneously. I believe you, I said, and I did. But love without trust and honesty isn't enough. Not anymore. Not for me. He nodded slowly, resignation settling over his features. The worst part is knowing that you've been carrying this alone for 20 years. All those times I thought I was protecting you by keeping my relationship with Catherine secret, you were actually the one protecting me, preserving our life together, despite knowing the truth. There was irony there, but I felt no satisfaction in it. We've both been living half-lives, Douglas. You divided between two women, me divided between knowledge and pretense. We talked for hours that day, excavating 3 decades of marriage like archaeologists, carefully brushing away layers of deception to reveal the artifacts of truth beneath. Douglas spoke of his reunion with Catherine, how what began as professional consultation had rekindled feelings he thought long extinguished. He described the guilt he felt after their first night together, his resolution to end it immediately, a resolution that weakened and crumbled each time they met. I shared my own journey, the shock of discovery, the careful collection of evidence, the complex emotions that had kept me silent for so many years. We cried together, these two aging preservationists, mourning not just the end of our marriage but the authentic relationship we might have had if honesty had been our foundation. As afternoon faded into evening, Douglas finally asked the question I had been expecting. What happens now? I handed him the separation agreement. This happens. You'll stay in the main house. I'll remain here in the carriage house while the divorce proceeds. We'll tell Lily together. We'll handle the business. Transitions professionally. He took the document but didn't open it. And after? After is not something we get to plan together, I said gently. That's the point of separation. He stood then, looking suddenly older than his 70 years. I never deserved you, Maggie. I see that now. After he left, I sat in the growing darkness, listening to the returning rain. A strange calm had settled over me, not happiness precisely, but something adjacent to it, perhaps the relief of finally standing in full daylight after decades in shadow. The next morning brought sunshine and an unexpected visitor. Patricia, Henderson, my attorney, arrived at the carriage house with a leather portfolio and a determined expression. I thought we should discuss strategy in person, she said, settling at my small dining table without waiting for an invitation. Patricia and I had known each other for years through the Historical Society, where she served as legal counsel. She had always impressed me with her straightforward manner and razor-sharp mind. I've reviewed the financial documents you provided, she continued, spreading papers before me. You're being extremely generous, Margaret. Some would say too generous. I examined the figures, the division of assets, the business valuation, the retirement accounts. It's fair, Patricia. I don't want a battle. I just want clarity and completion. She leaned back, studying me over her reading glasses. You know Douglas has already retained counsel? Edward Simmons? I nodded. Edward was known for aggressive representation, a surprising choice for Douglas, who typically avoided confrontation. Catherine's suggestion, I imagine, I murmured, more to myself than Patricia. Her eyebrows rose slightly. You've done your research? 20 years of it, I replied with a wry smile. Patricia gathered her papers, her expression softening slightly. Margaret, I admire your equanimity. Truly. But my job is to protect your interests, and I'm concerned you may be undervaluing your contributions to both the marriage and the business. I thought about this as I walked her to the door. My primary interest is in moving forward with dignity and sufficient resources to build my next chapter. Beyond that, the financial details matter less to me than you might expect. After she left, I found myself drawn to my desk, where an untouched sketchbook had been waiting for months. I opened it, picked up a pencil, and began to draw. Not a historical building this time, but something entirely new. A small cottage overlooking water, modern lines blending with traditional elements, large windows to capture natural light. I was so absorbed in the drawing that I almost missed the text message from Martin Everett, the director of the Coastal Preservation Trust. Martin and I had worked together on several projects over the years, a professional relationship marked by mutual respect and occasional spirited disagreements about restoration approaches. Heard you might be available for the Lighthouse Point project. Board meeting Thursday if you're interested in discussing. No pressure. I set down my pencil, staring at the message. The Lighthouse Point restoration was a prestigious, challenging project, exactly the kind of work I loved, but had often declined, due to Douglas's reluctance to spend extended periods on the coast. Too far from our primary clients, he would say. Not worth the time investment. Without hesitation, I replied, I'll be there Thursday. Send details. As I returned to my sketch, I realized I had unconsciously drawn the very coastline where the lighthouse stood. Perhaps my subconscious had been planning this move longer than I knew. The days that followed took on a strange rhythm. Meetings with Patricia, careful conversations with Douglas about practical matters, long walks alone through the town I had called home for 30 years. I found myself noticing details I had overlooked before. The way morning light transformed the stained glass in the community center we had restored, the friendly nods from shopkeepers who had known me for decades, the subtle shifts of seasonal color in the gardens along River Street. I was saying goodbye, I realized, not just to my marriage but to a particular version of myself, the accommodating wife, the silent partner, the woman who had built her identity around preservation of the past rather than creation of her future. The Thursday board meeting at the Coastal Preservation Trust went better than I anticipated. The lighthouse project was even more challenging than initial reports suggested. Structural damage from recent storms, limited access to the site, significant historical restrictions on renovation approaches. We need someone who understands both preservation requirements and structural realities, Martin explained as we walked the perimeter of the lighthouse keeper's cottage afterward. Someone who can see the whole picture, not just the historical elements. I stood at the edge of the cliff, watching waves crash against the rocks below. The air tasted of salt and possibility. I'd need to relocate to oversee the project properly, I said, thinking aloud. At least for the duration. Martin nodded. We've secured the Thornton cottage for the project manager. It's about a mile down the coast. Private, comfortable, fully furnished. I turned to look at him, suspicion dawning. How long have you been planning to approach me about this, Martin? He had the grace to look slightly abashed. The board approved reaching out to you 3 months ago, but I knew about your anniversary coming up. Thought it might not be the right time to suggest a project that would take you away from home. Laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise us both. The universe has impeccable timing, it seems. That evening, I returned to the carriage house with a stack of project documents and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. As I reviewed the lighthouse specifications, my phone lit up with a call from Lily. "Mom," she said without preamble, "I just talked to Dad. He told me everything. About Catherine, about the affair. About you knowing all this time." She paused, her voice thickening. "Why didn't you tell me? I could have been there for you." I sighed, setting aside the lighthouse plans. "It wasn't your burden to carry, sweetheart, and honestly, I was still figuring out what to do with the knowledge myself." For 20 years, the disbelief in her voice was palpable. "Life is rarely as straightforward as we want it to be," I said, gently, "especially when you've built something together for so long." "But he betrayed you," she insisted, over and over again. "Yes," I agreed. "And now I'm choosing a different path. That's what I want you to focus on, not what was done to me, but what I'm doing now." Our conversation lasted well into the night. I told her about the lighthouse project, about the possibility of relocating to the coast. She listened, initially, skeptical, then increasingly supportive as she heard the enthusiasm in my voice. "You sound different, Mom," she said finally. "Lighter somehow." "I feel different," I admitted. "Like I've set down something I've been carrying for a very long time." After we hung up, I stepped outside into the cool night air. The main house stood dark and silent across the garden. Douglas was staying with his brother for a few days, an arrangement that suited us both. I looked up at the stars, countless pinpoints of light against the vastness of the sky, and felt something unfamiliar expand within my chest. It took me a moment to recognize it as freedom, not the dramatic, soaring freedom of escaping captivity, but the quieter, deeper freedom of finally being the author of my own story. The next morning, I woke early and packed a small overnight bag. The coastal town where the lighthouse stood was just a 2-hour drive, close enough for a day trip, but I wanted time to explore, to imagine myself living there during the restoration project. As I placed my sketchbook and pencils in my bag, my phone chimed with an incoming email. Douglas had signed the separation agreement without amendments or conditions. His accompanying message was brief. "I hope you find the happiness you deserve. I'm sorry it couldn't be with me." I stood very still, letting the finality of it wash over me. 30 years of marriage, concluded in a digital signature and a 2-sentence email. It should have felt anticlimactic, perhaps even hurtful in its brevity. Instead, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude for this clean, uncomplicated ending. As I drove toward the coast that morning, the road stretching before me like a promise, I thought about the nature of restoration, how we carefully remove damaged layers, shore up weakened foundations, replace what cannot be salvaged, and ultimately create something that honors its history while standing strong in the present. Perhaps that was what I was doing now, I reflected as the first glimpse of ocean appeared on the horizon, restoring myself, not to what I had been before Douglas's betrayal, but to what I could become after it. The lighthouse came into view, its white tower stark against the blue sky. Weathered, damaged, but still standing after more than a century of storms, ready for skilled hands to reveal its strength and beauty once more. I smiled, pressing my foot gently on the accelerator. There was important work ahead, and I was eager to begin. The Thornton cottage exceeded my expectations. Perched on a rocky bluff overlooking the Atlantic, the small cedar-shingled house offered panoramic views of the coastline stretching north toward the lighthouse. Inside, the space was modest but thoughtfully designed. An open-concept main room with a wall of windows facing the ocean, a compact kitchen with surprisingly modern appliances, a bedroom with a reading nook tucked into a bay window, and a small, second bedroom that would make a perfect office. Previous occupant was a marine biologist, Martin explained as he handed me the keys. She left some of her furniture when she relocated to Australia last year. The trust acquired the property as part of our coastal conservation efforts. I ran my hand along the smooth driftwood banister leading to the loft space. "It's perfect." "It needs some work," Martin admitted, gesturing to water stains on the ceiling and the slightly warped floorboards near the deck doors. But I figured, you'd consider that a feature rather than a bug. I laughed. You know me too well. The move happened more quickly than I anticipated. Within 3 weeks of accepting the lighthouse project, I had packed essential belongings, arranged for the rest to go into storage, and said my goodbyes to Mapleton. Douglas and I had maintained a careful distance during this time, communicating, primarily through emails and our respective attorneys. The divorce proceedings were progressing smoothly, with the final dissolution expected within months rather than years. My last night in the carriage house was unexpectedly difficult. I sat on the small porch, watching fireflies dance above the garden, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing against my chest. Not regret exactly. I remained certain of my decision, but a profound awareness of all that was ending. The familiar rhythms of my daily life in Mapleton, the community connections built over years, the garden I had tended through countless seasons. I thought I might find you out here. I turned to find Douglas standing at the edge of the garden path, his hands thrust deep in his pockets. In the soft evening light, he looked like the man I had fallen in love with decades earlier, uncertain, vulnerable, genuine. I didn't mean to intrude, he continued when I remained silent. I just wanted to say goodbye properly. I gestured to the empty chair beside me. Would you like some tea? I still have the kettle out. He nodded, settling into the chair with a sigh. We sat in companionable silence as the fireflies continued their luminous dance and nightbirds called from the nearby woods. For the first time in years, maybe decades, the silence between us felt honest. The lighthouse project suits you, he said finally. It always was your kind of challenge. Complex, historically significant, right on the edge between preservation and reinvention. I smiled, a little surprised by his insight. Yes, it is. Though I didn't realize you'd noticed my preferences so specifically. I noticed more than you think, Maggie. Not enough, clearly, but more than you might believe. He paused, his profile silvered in the moonlight. I came across your sketches for the keeper's cottage restoration. They're brilliant, especially the curved glass installation in the lantern room. You went through my papers? The old anger flickered briefly. He shook his head quickly. No. You left them on the dining table last week when you came to collect. Your reference books. I shouldn't have looked, perhaps, but professional curiosity got the better of me. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. His minor breach of privacy compared to 30 years of deception. A small laugh escaped me, surprising us both. The curved glass was inspired by something I saw in Denmark years ago, I explained, choosing to let the moment of tension pass. It preserves the historical silhouette while bringing in more natural light. Douglas nodded. It's innovative without being intrusive. Classic Maggie Wilson approach. We talked about the lighthouse for another hour, falling into the comfortable professional exchange that had always been the strongest part of our relationship. As he rose to leave, he hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. I found this while going through some old files, he said, handing me a faded photograph. Thought you might want it. The image showed us standing together on the front porch, of our Victorian the day we completed its restoration, covered in dust but beaming with pride. We looked so young, so full of promise and shared purpose. Thank you, I said softly, slipping the photo into my pocket. For this, and for the years that were good. There were many of them, Douglas. He nodded, his eyes bright with unspoken emotion. Be magnificent, Maggie. You always were, even when I failed to see it. The next morning I drove away from Mapleton at dawn, the rising sun casting long shadows across the familiar streets. I didn't look back. Some endings demand forward focus, and this was one of them. My first weeks at the lighthouse were consumed with assessment work, documenting structural damage, researching historical records, developing preliminary preservation plans. The keepers, Cottage required immediate stabilization before winter storms arrived, so I focused there first, assembling a small team of local contractors skilled in historical restoration. The work was challenging in exactly the ways I had hoped. Technical problems that required creative solutions, historical constraints that demanded innovative approaches, coastal conditions that complicated every aspect of the restoration. I found myself completely absorbed, working from sunrise until, well, after sunset most days, falling into bed exhausted but deeply satisfied. "You're going to burn yourself out," Martin observed one evening when he stopped by to review progress. He gestured toward the stacks of research materials and technical drawings covering every surface of the cottage. "The lighthouse has stood for 150 years. It can wait another day or two while you actually enjoy this view you're paying for." I glanced up from the structural analysis I'd been studying, momentarily disoriented. Through the windows, the ocean stretched endlessly, painted in amber and rose by the setting sun. When had the sun begun to set? I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually walked down to the beach or sat on the deck simply to watch the waves. "Old habits," I said with a rueful smile. "I've spent decades filling every moment with productivity." Martin leaned against the doorframe, his weathered face thoughtful. "Productivity is overrated. Trust me on this. I've restored 17 historical structures along this coastline, and not one of them improved because I skipped a sunset." After he left, I forced myself to set aside the work. I made a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine, and stepped out onto the deck. The air was crisp with autumn's approach, carrying the clean scent of salt and seaweed. Waves crashed rhythmically against the rocks below, a sound both powerful and soothing. I had been so busy doing that I had forgotten about being. That night, I started a new ritual. Each evening as the sun began its descent, I would stop whatever I was working on, make tea or pour wine, and sit on the deck or walk along the shore. Sometimes I brought my sketchbook, but often I simply observed the changing light on the water, the flight patterns of shorebirds, the intricate details of shells and stones tumbled smooth by the tide. One evening in late October, I was returning from my sunset walk when I spotted an unfamiliar car parked beside the cottage. For a moment, I tensed, wondering if Douglas had decided to visit unannounced. Then the driver's door opened and Lily stepped out, waving enthusiastically. "Surprise!" she called, hurrying toward me with arms outstretched. Behind her, the twins tumbled from the back seat, now lanky 7-year-olds with their mother's smile and boundless energy. "Grandma Maggie," they chorused, racing down the path to engulf me in hugs that smelled of apple juice and childhood. Later, after the children were asleep in the loft bedroom, Lily and I sat on the deck wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkness in steady rhythm, its light briefly illuminating the cliff face before continuing its vigilant rotation. "I've never seen you like this, Mom," Lily said, studying me over the rim of her mug. "You seem, I don't know, present in a way you weren't before." I considered this. I think I was always focused on preserving things, buildings, relationships, family stability, at the expense of experiencing them fully. She nodded slowly. "That makes sense. You were always doing for everyone else." "Not entirely selfless," I admitted. "There's safety in caretaking. It gives you purpose, structure, identity. When you're responsible for maintaining everything, you don't have to ask harder questions about what you actually want." Lily reached over to squeeze my hand. "And what do you want now, Mom?" I gazed out at the darkness where I knew the ocean continued its eternal dance, invisible but present, powerful but yielding. "To be like water," I said finally, "yielding when necessary, powerful when required, always in motion, always finding my own level." Lily laughed softly. "Definitely not the answer you would have given a year ago." "No," I agreed with a smile. "Definitely not." After Lily and the twins left, the cottage felt simultaneously emptier and fuller, empty of their physical presence, but filled with the emotional resonance of their visit. I found myself approaching the lighthouse project with renewed perspective, less driven by perfection and more by mindful purpose. As November arrived with its shorter days and biting winds, I received an unexpected email from Catherine Denham. The subject line read simply, "Long overdue." I sat staring at my laptop screen, my finger hovering over the delete button. Did I want to hear from the woman who had shared my husband for 3 decades? What possible benefit could come from opening this particular door? Curiosity won out, over caution. I clicked. "Margaret, you don't know me, though in some strange way I feel I know you through Douglas's stories over the years. First, let me say that no apology can adequately address 30 years of deception, but I am deeply sorry for my role in it. Douglas recently told me about your lighthouse project. The restoration approach you've proposed for the lantern room is remarkable. Exactly the kind of solution that honors historical integrity while addressing modern structural requirements. I've enclosed some research on historical glass restoration techniques that might be useful. No obligation to respond or acknowledge. I understand if you prefer no contact." With respect and regret, Catherine attached were several scholarly articles on heritage glass conservation, including rare technical specifications from European lighthouse, restorations that I had been unable to locate through my usual research channels. I closed my laptop without responding, unsure what to feel. Anger seemed the appropriate reaction, but what surfaced instead was a complex mixture of gratitude for the valuable research, curiosity about this woman who had occupied such a significant space in my marriage, and a strange sense of recognition. One professional acknowledging another across an impossible divide. That night, as I walked along the shore in the gathering darkness, the lighthouse beam swept over me, momentarily illuminating my path before moving on. In that brief clarity, I realized something fundamental had shifted within me. The photograph I had placed before Douglas on our anniversary night had been meant as an ending, evidence of betrayal, proof of deception, the final period at the end of a 30-year sentence. But perhaps it had actually been a beginning, the first honest moment in decades, the initial crack that allowed light to enter, the necessary breaking that preceded true restoration. I turned toward the cottage, its windows glowing warm against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges with the lighthouse project, new decisions about my evolving life, new opportunities to choose presence over perfection. For tonight, it was enough to stand at the edge of the ocean, feeling the vast possibility of a future I was finally free to create for myself. Winter transformed the lighthouse and surrounding coastline. Steel-gray waves crashed against ice-crusted rocks, sending frozen spray shooting upward like crystalline sculptures that glinted briefly in the pale sunlight before surrendering to gravity. The wind howled relentlessly, finding every gap in the cottage's weathered exterior, a constant reminder of the power of nature and the importance of sound construction. I had never experienced winter by the sea. In Mapleton, winter meant snow-covered gardens and frost-etched windows, the muffled silence of a small town hibernating until spring. Here, winter was wild, fierce, and strangely exhilarating, a daily confrontation with elemental forces that demanded respect, but also awakened something primal within me. The lighthouse restoration proceeded despite the challenging conditions. We had successfully stabilized the keeper's cottage before the worst weather arrived, enabling interior work to continue through December and January. The lighthouse tower itself, the most historically significant and structurally complex component, would wait for spring, when conditions would allow for the specialized masonry repairs and glass installation. My days fell into a satisfying rhythm. Mornings spent reviewing progress with the construction foreman, Eli, a taciturn local craftsman in his 50s, with an encyclopedic knowledge of historical building techniques, afternoons dedicated to documentation and planning, evenings for myself, reading, sketching, occasionally joining community events in the small coastal town 20 minutes away. I had responded to Catherine's email with a brief, professional thank you for the research materials, which had indeed proved valuable to the lantern room restoration plans. Our subsequent exchanges remained strictly focused on technical aspects of historical glass conservation, a correspondence that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier, but now felt like an unexpected form of healing. We never mentioned Douglas. The divorce was finalized 2 days before Christmas, a strange holiday gift, but one that brought more relief than regret. Douglas and I marked the occasion with a brief phone call, wishing each other well before returning to our separate lives. He had moved to Boston, I learned from Lily, though she carefully avoided mentioning whether Catherine was part of this relocation. January brought the harshest weather of the season, a nor'easter that pounded the coast for 3 straight days, confining me to the cottage as winds reached hurricane force and visibility dropped to near zero. I stood at the window watching the lighthouse disappear and reappear through swirling snow, its beam cutting through the whiteout in steady pulses. On the storm's 3rd day, the power failed. I was prepared with candles, blankets, and a well-stocked pantry. But the sudden silence as the heating system shut down was unnerving. The cottage temperature dropped rapidly as the fierce wind found every crack and crevice in the century-old structure. I was arranging candles on the kitchen counter when a pounding at the door startled me. Opening it revealed Eli, snow-covered and grim-faced. "Generator at the work site's running," he said without preamble. "Keeper's cottage is warmer than this place. You'd better come before the roads are completely impassable." 20 minutes later, I was settled in the partially restored Keeper's cottage, where a commercial generator hummed steadily outside, powering space heaters and basic lighting. Eli moved around the space efficiently, checking windows and adjusting heaters. "Should hold through the night," he said, finally pausing to remove his heavy coat. "Highway department says power crews can't get out until tomorrow at earliest." I glanced around the cottage, walls partially deconstructed to reveal original post and beam framing, plastic sheeting covering unfinished sections, construction materials neatly stacked in corners. Yet despite its unfinished state, the space felt solid, secure against the storm raging outside. "Thank you for thinking of me," I said, warming my hands around a mug of tea from Eli's thermos. "I would have managed, but this is certainly more comfortable." He shrugged, settling into a folding chair across from me. "Didn't seem right leaving you out there alone in this." His normally stoic expression softened slightly. "My grandmother lived in your cottage back in the 70s. Those windows were drafty even then." This personal detail, the first he had shared in months of working together, opened a door to conversation. As the storm howled outside, Eli told me about growing up in the coastal community, about his grandmother who had worked as a marine biologist studying tidal ecosystems, about his own journey from fishing boats to construction sites to historical restoration. "Always had a feeling for old buildings," he explained, his weathered hands cradling his mug. "They've got stories in their bones, you know? Seems wrong to tear them down when they've survived so much already." I nodded, recognizing the sentiment that had guided my own career. That's precisely why preservation matters, not just saving physical structures, but honoring the human stories they contain. We talked for hours, the professional boundaries between project manager and contractor dissolving as the storm isolated us from the outside world. Eli shared his concerns about the lighthouse beam mechanism, which was showing signs of metal fatigue beyond what our initial assessment had identified. I discussed my ongoing correspondence with Catherine, whose expertise in historical glass conservation had proven invaluable to our revised restoration approach. "Strange, isn't it?" I mused as the evening deepened. "The woman who was part of my husband's deception is now helping preserve something I care deeply about. Eli considered this, his expression thoughtful. Life's rarely clean-cut as we'd like. Good comes from unexpected places sometimes. When the conversation eventually turned to my marriage and divorce, I found myself sharing the story with surprising ease. The discovery of the affair, the years of silent knowledge, the anniversary revelation. 30 years is a long time to carry something like that, Eli observed, his tone free of judgment. Most would have confronted it right away or walked out. I've often wondered if that was weakness or strength, I admitted, staying so long, knowing what I knew. Neither, maybe, he suggested. Just human. We do what makes sense at the time with what we've got. The storm began to abate near midnight, but we continued talking as the wind's howl softened to an occasional moan. There was something liberating about sharing my story with someone who had no connection to my previous life, who knew me only as Margaret the preservationist, not as Maggie the betrayed wife. Dawn broke clear and brilliantly cold. The world, transformed into a dazzling landscape of snow and ice. Power crews were already visible on the main road, working to restore electricity to the area. Eli made coffee on a camping stove while I stepped outside to take in the breathtaking scene. The lighthouse stood stark against the blue sky, its white tower encased in a glittering sheath of ice that caught the morning sun like a faceted diamond. Beyond it, the ocean stretched calm and luminous after the storm's fury. Its surface rippled with gentle waves that belied its power. Quite a sight, isn't it? Eli had joined me, offering a steaming mug. This is why I never moved away, even when the fishing industry collapsed. Some views you can't put a price on. I nodded, understanding completely. I think I expected to feel like an outsider here, but somehow I don't. That's because you see what matters, he said simply. The bones of the place, the heart of it. Not everyone does. 2 days later, with power restored and roads cleared, work on the lighthouse resumed. My interactions with Eli remained professional, but were now underlaid with the quiet understanding that comes from sharing truths during extraordinary circumstances. Nothing romantic. We were both too practical, too dedicated to our respective roles in the restoration project for that. But a friendship had formed, unexpected and valuable. As February arrived with gradually lengthening days, I received a message from Martin Everett that would once again alter my course. The trust has acquired another property, he informed me during his monthly site visit. The Benedict Hotel in Porter's Cove, about 30 miles north, built in 1895, operated continuously until last year. Owner passed away, heirs wanted to sell to developers for condos, but we managed to step in. I knew the property, a magnificent Queen Anne structure overlooking a natural harbor, renowned for its ornate woodwork and stained glass details. Ambitious acquisition, I commented. Restoration costs will be substantial. Martin nodded. That's actually why I'm mentioning it. The board is considering establishing a permanent restoration director position, someone to oversee all trust properties on an ongoing basis rather than project by project. Your work here has impressed everyone, Margaret. I stared at him, processing the implications. You're offering me a permanent position? Informally, yes. The official process would involve an application and interviews, but I wanted to gauge your interest first. It would mean staying in the area long term. That evening, I sat on the cottage deck despite the cold, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky as I contemplated Martin's offer. The lighthouse beam swept across the water in its eternal rhythm, constant, reliable, illuminating the darkness for those seeking safe harbor. 6 months ago, I had been Margaret Wilson, wife of Douglas, partner in a successful restoration business, resident of Mapleton, keeper of secrets. Now I was simply Margaret, professional in my own right, grandmother, coastal dweller, truth-teller. The transformation had not been without pain, but standing on the other side of it, I felt more authentically myself than I had in decades. My phone chimed with an incoming text from Lily. "The twins have a 3-day weekend next month. Okay if we visit again? They can't stop talking about the lighthouse." I smiled, typing back immediately. "Always welcome. I'll be here. I'll be here." 3 simple words that somehow contained a world of decision. As I looked toward the lighthouse, its beam flashing steadily through the gathering darkness, I realized I had found not just a project or a temporary refuge, but a place where I could build something new, a life entirely my own, grounded in honesty, purpose, and unexpected connection. The photograph I had placed before Douglas on our anniversary night had been meant as an ending. Instead, it had become the beginning of a story I was only now learning how to tell, my own. Spring arrived at the coast with dramatic intensity. One week, the landscape remained winter-gripped, the next erupting in vibrant green as salt-resistant vegetation reclaimed the rocky terrain. The transformation mirrored my own internal shifts, changes that had once seemed impossible now unfolding with natural momentum. I accepted the Coastal Preservation Trust's permanent position after careful consideration. The role offered creative challenges, professional autonomy, and the opportunity to remain in this place that had unexpectedly become home. My acceptance came with one condition: that I be allowed to personally complete the lighthouse restoration before transitioning to broader responsibilities. "That's a given," Martin had assured me. "The board would have it no other way." April brought the most technically challenging phase of the restoration, the lantern room glass installation. The curved panels had been custom manufactured based on my specifications, incorporating both historical accuracy and modern safety standards. Catherine's research had proven invaluable, enabling us to recreate the unique prismatic effects of the original 19th century glass while meeting contemporary requirements. "They're magnificent," Eli said the morning the crates arrived, carefully inspecting each panel. "Better than I expected, honestly." I smiled, pleased by both the quality of the glass and his uncharacteristic display of enthusiasm. Credit goes to the fabrication team, and to Catherine Denham's technical specifications. He glanced at me, a question in his expression. "You ever planning to meet her? In person, I mean." The question caught me off guard. Catherine and I had maintained our professional correspondence throughout the winter, but the possibility of actually meeting had never been discussed. "I don't know," I admitted. "Our communications have been valuable professionally, but there's still the personal history to consider." Eli nodded, returning his attention to the glass panels. "Just seems like an unfinished conversation, that's all." His observation lingered with me as we prepared for the installation. Was Catherine indeed an unfinished conversation in my life? Story? Despite our productive professional exchange, we had carefully avoided any mention of Douglas or the 30-year triangle that had connected us without my knowledge. The installation proceeded over several days, requiring precision, patience, and specialized expertise. I worked alongside the team, handling the most delicate aspects of the process myself. As each panel was secured in place, the lantern room gradually transformed, light flooding the space in brilliant patterns that would soon guide vessels safely through coastal waters once more. On the final day of installation, as the last panel was being secured, my phone chimed with an incoming message. Catherine Denham. The glass fabricators sent photographs of the completed panels before shipping. Breathtaking work, Margaret. You've managed to honor history while creating something entirely new. I would very much like to see the completed installation, if that's something you'd consider. I stood in the lantern room, surrounded by the play of light through the newly installed glass, reading her message several times. The team waited respectfully, sensing the importance of the moment. Finally, I typed my reply. The installation will be complete today. The official lighting ceremony is scheduled for May 15th. You would be welcome to attend. Her response came quickly. Thank you. I'll be there. I slipped my phone away and returned my attention to the final adjustments. Through the newly installed glass, the view extended for miles, endless ocean, rugged coastline, distant sails catching afternoon light. The perspective from this height was transformative, offering a vision of the world unavailable from ground level. "It's ready," Eli announced as the team secured the final fittings. "Want to test the beam?" Though the official relighting would come later, we had all worked too hard to resist this moment. I nodded, and he activated the mechanism. The lighthouse beams sprang to life, amplified and directed by the restored lens and new glass, cutting through the afternoon light in a powerful demonstration of its nocturnal purpose. "That," Eli said with quiet satisfaction, "is something to be proud of." Standing in that illuminated space, watching the beam reach toward the horizon, I felt something shift within me, a final piece settling into place. The lighthouse was ready to fulfill its purpose once more. And perhaps so was I. The weeks before the relighting ceremony were filled with final details and preparations. The restored keeper's cottage would serve as a visitor center and educational space, showcasing the history of the lighthouse and the surrounding coastal ecosystem. I designed exhibits that honored both the human stories and technical innovations that had made the lighthouse a beacon of safety for over a century. Lily called, frequently excited about attending the ceremony with the twins and her husband. "Mom, I've been following your project updates online. The before and after photos are incredible. You've created something remarkable." "It was a team effort," I reminded her. "And the lighthouse itself did most of the work by surviving long enough to be restored. Still," she insisted, "it wouldn't have happened without your vision." "Dad says the same thing." I paused, surprised. "You've discussed it with your father?" "He follows the Trust's website," she explained. "Says the lighthouse restoration is a perfect example of your design philosophy, preserving what matters while allowing for necessary evolution." The observation was unexpectedly perceptive coming from Douglas, who had often favored more traditional preservation approaches during our professional partnership. "That's actually a fair assessment," I admitted. He also mentioned that Catherine Denham contributed to the glass restoration research. That must have been complicated. I smiled at my daughter's diplomatic phrasing. "Life rarely offers completely clean narratives, sweetheart. Sometimes the most valuable collaborations come from unexpected sources." The day of the relighting ceremony arrived with perfect coastal spring weather, bright sunshine, moderate breeze, temperatures warm enough for comfort without summer's humidity. The Trust had arranged for shuttle transportation from town, as parking near the lighthouse was limited. By mid-afternoon, a sizable crowd had gathered: local residents, preservation enthusiasts, maritime history buffs, and officials from the Coast Guard and Navigation Authority. I spotted Lily and her family as they arrived, the twins immediately racing toward me with excited shouts about riding in a real shuttle bus. Behind them, I noticed Martin escorting an elegant woman in her late 60s with silver-streaked dark hair, Catherine Denham, exactly as I remembered from the photographs I had collected over the years. Our eyes met across the gathering crowd, and after a moment's hesitation, she made her way toward me. Up close, she looked both familiar and unknown. The woman from the photographs now three-dimensional, real, present. "Margaret," she said simply, extending her hand. "Thank you for allowing me to be here." I accepted her handshake, noting the firm grip, the direct gaze, the careful neutrality of her expression. "Your technical assistance was instrumental to the restoration's success. It seemed appropriate for you to witness the results." We stood in awkward silence until Eli appeared at my side, offering to show Catherine the interior features of the lighthouse before the formal ceremony began. As they walked away, I felt an unexpected lightness. The encounter had neither the emotional weight nor dramatic tension I might have anticipated. She was simply a colleague, a fellow professional, her connection to my past marriage now seemingly incidental rather than defining. The ceremony proceeded with appropriate dignity. Speeches from trust officials, acknowledgement of the restoration team, historical context provided by local maritime experts. As twilight approached, I was invited to activate the lighthouse beam for its official return to service. Standing in the lantern room with representatives from the Coast Guard and Navigation Authority, I placed my hand on the switch that would bring the lighthouse fully back to life. Through the glass panels, I could see the gathered crowd below, faces turned upward in anticipation. Among them, my family, my colleagues, and yes, Catherine Denham, all witnesses to this moment of restoration. Throughout its history, this lighthouse has served one essential purpose, I said, the words coming naturally despite my usual discomfort with public speaking. To guide travelers safely through darkness, to illuminate dangers, to mark the way home. Today, we honor that purpose by returning this beacon to service, not just as a historical monument, but as a working lighthouse once more. I activated the switch and the beam sprang to life, powerful and precise, sweeping across darkening waters as it had for generations before, and would for generations to come. The crowd below applauded, their faces illuminated with each passing of the light. Later, as guests enjoyed refreshments in the keeper's cottage, I found a quiet moment alone on the observation deck. The spring evening had deepened to true darkness, making the lighthouse beam all the more dramatic against the night sky. "It's magnificent," Douglas said, appearing beside me so unexpectedly that I startled slightly. "I didn't know you were coming," I said, recovering my composure. He gave a small, apologetic smile. "Lily mentioned it. I hope it's all right that I'm here." I nodded, surprised to find I meant it. "Of course. It's a public celebration." We stood in companionable silence, watching the beam complete its rotations. Finally, Douglas spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know what I've realized, Maggie? All those years, I was the one in the dark, not you. You saw everything clearly, my deception, your own worth, what our marriage truly was. While I was stumbling around thinking I was managing two separate lives successfully, you were the lighthouse, steady, perceptive, illuminating what I couldn't see myself." I considered his words, touched by their insight if not entirely convinced of their accuracy. "Perhaps. But lighthouses don't guide for their own benefit, Douglas. They exist to help others navigate safely. And that's exactly what you did," he said quietly. "You navigated us both to safer shores, even if it meant separate ones." The metaphor was imperfect, but held enough truth to acknowledge with a nod. We had both reached safer shores, if not the ones we had originally charted together. "Catherine mentioned you two have been corresponding about the glass restoration," Douglas said after another pause. "That must have been complex." "Initially," I admitted, "but there's a certain clarity that comes with focusing on shared professional interests rather than personal history." He smiled ruefully. "You always did have a gift for finding the practical path forward." From below, Lily called, "Up to us." The twins were getting tired and they wanted to say goodbye before leaving. Douglas and I descended together, the moment of reflection complete. As the celebration wound down and guests departed, I found myself back in the lantern room, alone with the magnificent mechanism that now functioned exactly as designed. Catching light, focusing it, projecting it outward to guide ships safely through darkness. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from the shock of discovering Douglas's affair, through decades of silent knowledge, to the anniversary night, when I had finally spoken my truth. The photograph I had placed before him that night had changed everything, not because it exposed his deception, but because it liberated me from mine. Now, standing in this tower of light, I understood something essential. Restoration isn't about returning something to what it once was, but about honoring its core purpose while allowing it to evolve. The lighthouse before me was both historical artifact and modern navigational aid. its value lying precisely in this duality. And perhaps the same was true for me. I had not returned to who I was before Douglas's betrayal, or even before our marriage. I had instead restored my essential self, my core purpose, my authentic voice, while allowing decades of experience to shape me into someone both familiar and entirely new. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across dark waters, guiding ships, away from hidden dangers and toward safe harbor. Inside, I stood in its source, finally understanding that after years of illuminating the way for others, I had at last found my own path forward, not despite the darkness I had traversed, but because of the light I had cultivated within it. 1. Year after the lighthouse relighting ceremony, I stood in the grand ballroom of the restored Benedict Hotel, watching as community members and preservation enthusiasts explored the space that had once been the social heart of Porter's Cove. The Coastal Preservation Trust's ambitious restoration was complete, and tonight's gala celebration marked both its official reopening and my first anniversary as the Trust's Director of Restoration. "You've outdone yourself, Margaret," Martin said, appearing at my side with 2 glasses of champagne. "When we acquired this property, I honestly wasn't sure it could be saved." I accepted the glass, taking in the restored plasterwork ceiling, refurbished hardwood floors, and meticulously recreated wallpaper patterns, all illuminated by the original chandeliers we had painstakingly rewired and reinstalled. "The building wanted to be saved," I replied. "It just needed someone to listen carefully enough to what it was saying." Martin laughed. "And there's the quote for our next fundraising brochure." The Benedict Hotel restoration had been my first major project after the lighthouse, a significantly different challenge requiring not just historical accuracy, but commercial viability. The Trust had partnered with a hospitality group to operate the hotel while maintaining its historical integrity, a delicate balance of preservation and practicality. As guests admired the restoration details, I spotted a familiar figure across the room: Diane Maxwell, editor of Preservation Quarterly, the leading publication in the field. We had corresponded extensively over the past year, with the magazine featuring both the lighthouse and now the Benedict Hotel in major articles, but this was our first in-person meeting. "Margaret Wilson," she said warmly, approaching with hand extended. "I'm delighted to finally meet the woman who's revolutionizing coastal preservation approaches." I smiled, accepting the handshake. "That's quite an overstatement." "Not according to my sources," she countered. "Your integration of historical techniques with sustainable materials at the lighthouse has become a case study at 3 universities that I know of." We chatted about technical aspects of both restorations, eventually finding a quiet corner where the conversation could flow more easily. Diane was refreshingly direct, passionate about preservation but unsentimental, a perspective I had come to value. "I've been meaning to ask," she said after we had exhausted the technical discussions, "how you transitioned from partnership in a successful preservation firm to coastal restoration specialist. Your previous work with Wilson & Wilson was quite different." The question was professional on its face, but I caught the careful curiosity beneath it. Industry gossip being what it was, Diane likely knew the broad outlines of my divorce and career change. "Life took an unexpected turn," I replied simply. "I found myself with an opportunity to approach preservation from a new angle, in a new environment. It proved to be exactly what I needed professionally." She nodded, accepting my diplomatic answer. "And the personal renewal that often accompanies such professional shifts?" I smiled, appreciating her directness. "That, too, has been rewarding, if occasionally challenging. I'd love to feature that aspect in our profile of the Benedict restoration," Diane said. "Not the personal details, of course, but the human element behind the professional work. Readers connect with the people who make preservation happen, not just the techniques they employ." I considered her proposal. A year ago, I would have politely declined, steering the conversation back to safer technical ground. But now, the prospect of sharing my professional journey, with appropriate boundaries, felt right. I'd be open to discussing that perspective, I agreed. Though I suspect the buildings themselves make for more interesting subjects. You'd be surprised, Diane replied with a knowing smile. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around me, I stepped out onto the hotel's wide veranda overlooking the harbor. The September evening was mild, stars emerging above boats gently bobbing at their moorings. In the distance, the lighthouse beams swept steadily across the darkening water, a rhythm that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. "There you are," Eli said, joining me at the veranda railing. "Hiding from your admirers?" I laughed, taking a moment to appreciate what we've accomplished without having to articulate it for anyone else. He nodded, understanding immediately, as he so often did. Our relationship had evolved over the past year, moving gradually from professional colleagues to friends to something neither of us had felt the need to explicitly define. We worked together on trust projects, shared occasional meals, enjoyed comfortable silences, and respected each other's independence, a natural partnership free from the expectations and deceptions that had characterized my marriage. The Benedict turned out even better than the plans promised, he observed, especially the solarium restoration. That curved glass installation was a risk that paid off. Catherine's suggestion, I acknowledged. The original plans called for standard replacement panels, but she insisted the curved glass was essential to the room's character. Eli glanced at me. "You two still corresponding?" "Occasionally. She's consulting on the Westbrook Library restoration now." He nodded, absorbing this information without comment. Another quality I had come to value in him. Eli never pushed for more than I was ready to share, never required explanations for the complex relationships that made up my life. "Speaking of correspondence," I added, "Lily called this morning. The twins are starting a maritime history unit at school, and she wondered if I might be willing to give a virtual presentation about lighthouse restoration." "From restoration director to elementary school lecturer," Eli said with a smile. "Your career continues to evolve." It seems fitting somehow. Part of preservation is education, ensuring younger generations understand the value of what we're trying to save. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the lighthouse beam make its steady revolutions. Below us, party guests spilled onto the hotel grounds, their laughter carrying across the evening air. "I received an interesting invitation last week," I said after a while. "The International Heritage Conservation Conference in London. They've asked me to present our approach to the lighthouse restoration, specifically the integration of historical glass techniques with modern safety requirements." Eli raised an eyebrow. "Prestigious offer. You going?" "I'm considering it. I haven't been to Europe since a brief trip in my 20s. It seems like an opportunity worth exploring. The world beyond Mapleton turns out to be navigable after all," he observed, referencing a conversation we'd had months earlier about my previous reluctance to travel far from home. I smiled, acknowledging the gentle teasing. Apparently so. 2 months later, I stood at the podium in a London conference centre, presenting the lighthouse restoration to an international audience of preservation specialists. My initial nervousness had given way to comfortable engagement as I shared not just the technical aspects of the project, but also the philosophical approach that had guided it. "Restoration isn't merely about returning a structure to its original state," I explained, advancing to slides showing the lighthouse lantern room before and after renovation. "It's about honoring the essential purpose of the building while allowing it to meet contemporary needs. Our lighthouses must function as navigational aids for modern vessels, even as they preserve historical techniques and materials." The presentation was well received, generating thoughtful questions and collegial discussions that continued into the evening reception. Several European preservationists expressed interest in visiting the Trust's projects, and I found myself exchanging contact information with professionals from Scotland, France, and Denmark. "Your pragmatic approach is refreshing," commented a Dutch architectural historian as we discussed adaptive reuse strategies. Too often we become so focused on historical purity that we forget buildings must continue to serve meaningful purposes. The AUK conference spanned a week, but I had arranged to stay in London for an additional 10 days, an unprecedented luxury of time for personal exploration. Each morning, I set out with a carefully researched itinerary: historic buildings, architectural landmarks, museums housing artifacts I had previously studied only in books. Yet, as the days passed, I found myself increasingly deviating from my plans, drawn instead to unexpected discoveries. A tiny bookshop specializing in architectural texts, a garden hidden behind an unassuming wall, a riverside path that offered views of the city unavailable from more popular vantage points. On my final evening in London, I sat in a small cafe near the Thames, sipping tea and watching twilight settle over the city. My notebook lay open before me, pages filled with sketches and observations, not just of historic buildings but of people, moments, impressions that had nothing to do with preservation work and everything to do with simply being present. My phone chimed with an incoming message from Lily, accompanied by a photograph of the twins proudly displaying lighthouse drawings they had created for their maritime history project. "Their teacher says they're the class experts now thanks to Grandma's virtual tour," she had written. "When are you coming home? They have a million questions about London for you." Home. The word resonated differently than it once had. Home was no longer a place defined by marriage or obligation. It was the lighthouse cottage with its panoramic views and weathered charm. It was the community that had welcomed me without reservation. It was the work that challenged and fulfilled me. It was the relationships I had built on foundations of honesty rather than expectation. But home was also expanding now to include this wider world I was finally exploring. London today, perhaps Denmark or Scotland in the future. The possibilities stretched before me like the Thames, flowing steadily toward broader horizons. I typed a reply to Lily. "Back next week. Bringing special souvenirs for budding lighthouse experts. Planning for your family to visit at Christmas. The Benedict Hotel has an excellent holiday program. Love you all." As I settled the bill and gathered my belongings, I caught sight of my reflection in the cafe window. Silver hair elegantly styled, eyes bright with experience and engagement. Posture, straight and confident. At 68, I recognized myself more fully than I had at 48, when the carefully constructed facade of my marriage had required me to be someone other than who I truly was. Walking back to my hotel through lamplit streets, I thought about the photograph I had placed before Douglas on our anniversary night. The tangible evidence of deception that had ultimately freed us both from a marriage built on shifting foundations. The image that had once represented pain and betrayal now seemed like a distant artifact from another life, historically significant, but no longer emotionally relevant. The next morning, as my flight carried me westward over the Atlantic, I opened my notebook to a fresh page. Instead of sketching historic buildings or restoration concepts, I began writing, not technical specifications or project timelines, but the beginning of a memoir. Not a bitter account of betrayal, but a thoughtful exploration of how discovery, even painful discovery, can lead to restoration of the most important kind. I titled the first page, "The Lighthouse Keeper: Reflections on Illumination, Restoration, and Finding True North After 60. Beneath it, I wrote the opening lines. Douglas and I had been married for 30 years when I placed a single photograph before him on our anniversary night, evidence of his ongoing affair that I had silently known about for 2 decades. That moment was not the tragedy it appeared to be, but rather the beginning of the most authentic chapter of my life. As the plane descended through clouds toward the coast I now called home, I closed the notebook, satisfied with this beginning. The lighthouse would soon come into view, its beam invisible in daylight, but faithfully continuing its rotations, steady and true. much like the woman I had finally become. The story was mine now, to live and to tell in my own voice, illuminated by truth and open to all the possibilities that stretched beyond the horizon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.